Hi, everyone, and welcome to Talks at Google. I'm Lisa, and today I'll be moderating a talk with economic anthropologist and author, Dr. Jason Hickel. Jason's research focuses on global inequality, political economy, post-development, and ecological economics, which are the subjects of his two most recent books, The Divide, A Brief Guide to Global Inequality and Its Solutions, and Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World. Please welcome Jason to the stage.
Hello.
Hi, Jason. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So Jason, I discovered your book, The Divide, a few months ago, and it was passed on to me by a friend who was really impacted by the things he learned from this book. And it affected me in the same way, especially in these times. It felt like it helped me understand some of the systemic injustices that have been surfacing lately, especially where I live in the US. I felt like I was fed this false narrative of what our role is being a part of the richest country in the world. So Jason, I'd like to start off our conversation with having you give us a broad overview of the misconceptions we have of global inequality and our understanding of globalization.
Okay, yeah. To do that, I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. I just have a couple of slides, not very many. Just 1 second here.
Sure.
All right, can you see this?
Yep.
Great. So I guess the first misconception I want to address that is quite prominent out there is the question of how bad global poverty actually is right now. What's happening in terms of trends in global poverty and global inequality? And the dominant narrative that's out there is basically that global poverty is diminishing really quickly and is over the past couple of decades and is about to effectively disappear. And that narrative comes from basically this graph, which is a graph of the number of people living under the World Bank's poverty line of $1.90 a day. Okay, and as we can see over the past few decades, beginning in 1981, when this data begins, there's been this dramatic decline of people living under this line, right? Now, there's a few problems with this narrative, but first of all, I should mention that this narrative has been leveraged to justify the status quo of the global economy, to say everything's working really well, and specifically has been brought on stage basically to say, look, if you're concerned about inequality, like Bernie Sanders is, like Jeremy Corbyn is, like the Pope is, etc., you shouldn't worry about it too much because ultimately the economy is working for the poorest, and we should celebrate that and keep going, right? And this narrative has been used to justify specifically neoliberal globalization since the 1980s. Now, there's a few problems with the narrative, and the first is that the vast majority of these gains against global poverty have come from one place. And if you think about where that might be, you can probably guess. And the answer is China. And if you take China out of the picture, then what you get is this green line, which basically shows that over this period, and this data only goes to 2010, but the trend is pretty similar for the past few years. We can see that the number of people living under the poverty line of $1.90 a day is roughly the same as it was in the 1980s. So it increased actually a little bit during the 80s and 90s for reasons we'll discuss shortly. But there's another problem with this narrative, and that is that, believe it or not, as ubiquitous as the $1.90 a day line is, there's actually no empirical basis for this line in terms of its ability to meet actual human needs, right? So we have piles of data in the scholarly literature showing that people who live at this line or even above it are unable to meet basic needs, even basic nutrition, and have very low life expectancies and very high infant mortality rates, et cetera, et cetera. So scholars are quite clear that, I should mention also, like this figure, $1.90 a day, is what one can buy in the USA with $1.90, right? So this is not what an American can buy in Sudan with $1.90, but rather what an American can buy in America with $1.90. So you can get a sense for what that's like. I mean, it's basically nothing. I mean, think about living in San Francisco on $1.90 a day. So, so scholars for a long time have been saying we need much more than this. A minimum that's required to achieve basic nutrition and normal human life expectancy is about $7.40 a day in the empirical literature. Even the World Bank agrees with that assessment. And some scholars say that it should be much higher, around $15 a day, which is the US poverty line. So if we're going to peg purchasing power at the US dollar, we should think about the US poverty line versus $15 a day. So what happens if we rethink this narrative from the perspective of these empirical lines? The story changes quite a lot. We see that the number of people living under $7.40 a day, which is like the low end of the empirical poverty lines, has been rising pretty dramatically over the past few decades, with 1.2 billion people added to the ranks of the poor during the 80s and 90s, and has flattened off a little bit since then, right? During the commodity boom, et cetera, in the 21st century. So the story is actually a good deal bleaker than what we normally think. Yes, incomes have been rising a little bit by about 2 cents per year, but not by anywhere close enough to actually lift people out of poverty, right? So the vast majority of the world, lives in poverty. About 4.3 billion people, which is about 60% of humanity. So this makes it clear that the global economy is actually fundamentally failing the vast majority of humanity. Okay, and I think that should change our analysis a bit. This is what happens if we take China out of the equation. We see that the number of people has been rising pretty steadily over the entire period. Now, the reason this is important is because China's gains against poverty were not accomplished by neoliberal globalization. They were accomplished by state-led development policy, right? Which is precisely what, which is precisely against what the narrative celebrates, which is, free markets, deregulation, et cetera, et cetera. So it's true that China did, in fact, liberalize its economy to some extent, but it liberalized on its own terms. It was not forcibly liberalized, which is what happened to the rest of the global South during the 80s and 90s. Under what we call structural adjustment programs, which I'll try to describe a little bit later. Mm-hmm. This is the percentage of the world that's in poverty, excluding China. As you can see, it has stayed steady at about 60% of the human population over this period. But really briefly, before I go on, I just want to also talk about global inequality. Now, there's this narrative that global inequality that globalization has been good for inequality, has reduced inequality, has primarily benefited the global poor. And for that, the World Bank tends to use this graph, which shows relative changes in income over the whole period from 1980 to 2016, with income groups by percentile on the bottom axis here. So the poorest are on the left and the richest are on the right. The richest 1% are on the far right. And you can see the richest 1% have gained quite a lot, but the real gains have gone to the poorest 50%, whose incomes have almost doubled over this period. Now, the problem with this approach, of course, is that if you're starting from a very low base, like $1 a day, then a doubling of income is actually not very much at all. Whereas if you're starting from a high base, like $100,000 a year, then even a 50% increase is a significant amount. So what happens if we think about the distribution of global income in absolute terms? This is the picture that we get. We see that the vast majority of gains and income since 1980 have gone to the richest 1%, the richest 5% and 10%. Whereas the poorest 60% of humanity have gained virtually nothing. I mean, it's almost impossible to decipher how much they've gained, in fact. And then just one final question has to do with inequality between countries. We have this narrative, right, that the global South is catching up to the North. Is this backed up by evidence? It's not, in fact. This is World Bank data on real per capita income since 1960, since the end of colonialism. And what we see is that so this shows the US, Germany, France, UK, OECD, and European Union on the top, and then all developing regions, or all global South regions on the bottom, including China, a line for China, which is that black line. And what we see is that the real per capita income gap between the North and the South has exploded in the decade since the end of colonialism, quadrupling in size, okay? So there has been no convergence, no catch-up. There's been actually divergence big time. The global economy is more unequal today than it was under colonialism. So, and that's quite a sobering, I think, assessment.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Jason. Learning about these misconceptions is really shocking when I read about them in your book. So I have to ask, where do these misconceptions come from?
Well, I guess one thing is that the $1.90 a day line has just come to be so ubiquitous and taken for granted. I mean, it's repeated by the UN, and usually when journalists report on UN publications, then they don't take much time to investigate the academic literature behind it. So, the more robust empirical research has been taking place in academia, but that doesn't make make an appearance really in normal media reporting. Mm-hmm. But I think the other issue here is that there's a very powerful narrative that we have in our society, which is framed around the idea of aid and international development, right? So, we know that rich countries give a tremendous amount of aid to poor countries every year, around $130 billion, which is a lot of money. I mean, right? Like that's more than all of the profits of all of the banks in the US each year combined. So, there's this image that rich countries are doing quite a lot to help poor countries, and surely with all of this aid, that's going to be making a difference. But in fact, what we see is that much more money and other resources flow from the global south to the global north each year than flow the other direction. And this has been borne out in evidence recently that economists have published, finding that each year about $2 trillion US flows from global north to global south in terms of aid, foreign direct investment, loans, remittances, everything. But at the same time, we see that $5 trillion flows the other direction from south to north, right? So what that means is there's a $3 trillion net outflow from the global south to the global north. Or if we think about that in terms of comparison to the aid budget, we see that for every dollar of aid the south receives, they lose $24 in net outflows, right? So, and of course, for some countries it's much bigger and other countries it's much smaller. It depends on the country we're talking about. But effectively, the net effect is that poor countries are effectively developing rich countries rather than the other way around. So here too, this mythology that we have of rich countries being the benevolent givers of the global system turns out to be false. And in fact, we see that the aid narrative cloaks a darker reality, which is that rich countries are the takers of the system. And they have been, for the past 500 years since the onset of colonization. So in terms of these outflows, like just to give you a brief sense for what these entail, for example, we know that the global south loses about $60 billion US per year in extra patent licensing fees that it pays to Western multinational corporations under intellectual property laws in the WTO that didn't used to be there up until the mid-1990s. So that in and of itself was half the aid budget spent on additional patent licensing fees for things like medicines, right? They also lose about $200 billion a year in interest payments on external debts, which is nearly double the aid budget. They lose about $500 billion per year in repatriated profits. So multinational companies that operate in global south countries then don't reinvest their profits locally. They take them back and store them, in the US or the UK. And they actually shift quite a lot of their profits illegally back offshore through like abusive transfer pricing by avoiding tax jurisdictions in global south countries by shifting their profits between different branches of the same company. Or by stealing it through the trade system, through loopholes in the trade system. And losses through those two mechanisms amount to over $1 trillion US per year. I mean, these are huge outflows that get stored in tax havens controlled by Western countries like the City of London, like the British Virgin Islands, like Switzerland, et cetera. So, over and over again, we see that there are these significant outflows and losses the South suffers as a consequence of the way the global economy is structured. And all of that falls out of our usual understanding of how the global economy works in favor of this very simplistic fairy tale story we have about aid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As a part of the global north, these misconceptions almost feel like myths that get passed on far and wide. And it's a really difficult narrative to let go of. So can you tell us how these myths are sustained and perpetuated?
Well, in a way, it has quite a long history. It goes back to President Harry Truman, who back in 1949, in his inauguration speech, used the word development for the first time, right? Now, this is an interesting history. Crucially, his choice of this word as a point in his inauguration speech, which then became like a major campaign rallying point, was odd because there was no such idea, prior to this. It was introduced purely as kind of a PR gimmick, actually. Mm-hmm. And the idea that he and the speechwriters had was that, look, this is 1949. Colonialism is falling apart. U.S. Influence in Latin America has been really destructive, as we're kind of emerging into this more democratic era where we have the United Nations and decolonization and so on, what's the story we're going to tell about all of this, right? 350 years of colonization. What are we going to do about this? And so the idea here was basically to erase colonial history and make it seem as though, rich countries have just suddenly stumbled upon poor countries as if upon a remote island. And they were going to benevolently, out of the goodness of their hearts, help them, right? And so they were able to shift their image from the role of colonizer to the role of savior really effectively through this discourse of development. And it became extremely popular. And it's not surprising. I mean, in a way, it's like a salve on Western consciences and gives us a way of thinking about ourselves as sort of, heroes in the world. And it was very popular for Truman's audience and remains very popular today. I mean, huge numbers of students who graduate from universities want to go get involved in the development industry, right? Whatever it is, building wells or building orphanages, etc. It's part of the mythology, the core stories of our civilization, and it's repeated, at the very highest levels by people like Bill Gates, Nick Kristof in the New York Times, people like Hans Rosling and his organization Gapminder and Our World in Data, contribute to the production of this narrative that becomes very effective on social media as well. So I guess that these are some of the ways that I think the myth gets effectively sustained, despite its empirical invalidity.
Wow, yeah. So, Jason, you're an economic anthropologist, which is a really fascinating field of study. And I was wondering, kind of shifting gears a little bit, what inspired you to pursue researching this field of economics?
Yeah, well, so the traditional field of economics has become very mathematical and models based, and what really falls out of it is an analysis of history and power, right? And what economic anthropology does is bring precisely those elements back into the story. It wants to think about how economies change over time, how power relations work in economics, and so on. So that's what attracted me to it, and the reason is because I'm originally from a small country in southern Africa called Swaziland. It's now called Eswatini as of a couple of years ago. But I moved to the US for my university and PhD and so on. And so I sort of encountered global inequality up close and very personally, and immediately began wondering about how our world came to be so divided. And the usual narrative just never really sat well with me. The usual narrative that I was fed, in university, for instance, was that rich countries became rich because they had like good technology and good governance, right? They had like the steam engine and the flying shuttle and, good markets and so on. And voila, the Industrial Revolution emerges spontaneously from Western brilliance, and they become rich, and the rest is history. And this doesn't sit well with me because I knew a thing or two about colonialism, coming from a country that had only recently been decolonized. And what I knew is that while the dominant narrative makes it seem as though the fates of countries are down to their own internal conditions, I knew that the story was more complicated than that because there was at least 500 years of interaction between the global north and the global south through the colonial period. And these interactions were violent and deeply inequitable. And so the usual story we're fed is deeply ahistorical and deeply apolitical. It ignores history and it ignores power relations in the global economy. So this inspired me to spend what's now 2 decades studying economic history. And what becomes clear from this field of research is that the global South was effectively roped into the world economy on fundamentally unequal terms over this period. And the rise of Europe's industrialization happened because of that, right? Like, consider cotton and sugar, the two key commodities of the Industrial Revolution. These were extracted not from Europe, but rather from land stolen from indigenous peoples and with labor appropriated from enslaved Africans, right? So things like, colonization and the slave trade turn out to be essential to how industrialization actually worked in Europe, and yet that part of the story almost always falls out of our narrative. And so during this period, the South was basically made to be an exporter of cheap raw materials and cheap labor and an importer of Western manufactured output, right? Kind of like a captive market for Western manufacturers. And that basic relationship remains more or less in place today, right? It continues to be sustained by existing trade rules and so on. And this pattern of appropriation continues to remain in place as well. We know from recent data that the global North appropriates a net total of about 12 billion tons of raw materials from the South per year, effectively for free, because it maintains a monetary trade balance but a substantial resource trade imbalance, which is sustained by effectively depressing the cost of resources abroad. And so you get this big flow of resources from south to north that is not compensated for by any financial transactions. So yeah, this is the kind of thing that economic anthropology reveals for us, this broader history of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jason, you've been researching this field for a long time. I think you mentioned 2 decades, right? And you understand the long history of global inequality and how it became the foundations for the present. So I was wondering if you can tell us about how global inequality as we know it today came to be.
Yeah, well, so of course, I mean, there's colonialism, which is the main sort of baseline driver of global inequality, quite clearly, as I've described. But then what's interesting is what happened after colonialism. The story we tell ourselves is that everything was better and fair after colonialism. In reality, the truth is a bit more complex. So there was a moment of profound, almost miraculous change in the immediate post-colonial decades. The 50s, 60s, and 70s, you had, in the wake of decolonization, you had progressive governments in the global south rolling out these amazing anti-colonial reforms, trying to make their economies more self-sufficient and more equitable. They were introducing land reforms to shift land away from big holders back to peasants. They were improving workers' wages with strong labor rights and unions. They were investing in public services like healthcare and education. They were nationalizing key resources like oil. They were clamping down on foreign capital flights, et cetera, et cetera. And all of this, worked incredibly well. I mean, it was basically kind of Keynesian, almost Marxist-inspired approach to anti-colonial economics, and it was very successful. It drove per capita income growth rates up to 3.2% per year during this multi-decade period, which is more than double what the global north achieved during their own industrial revolution. I mean, this is really an incredible period. This is the period where, in addition, you had progressive governments uniting together to form like the non-aligned movement, arguing for their interests in the UN. They actually passed a program called the New International Economic Order that basically said, look, global South countries should have the rights to determine their own economic destinies without interference from the North. They were against this, new forms of colonization. But the problem with all of this is that it basically upset Western powers, right? Because Western powers were losing their access to the cheap labor and raw materials they'd been enjoying under colonialism. And so they began to intervene, first of all, in like a series of quite violent coups against these progressive leaders. So like Masrach in Iran, democratically elected, he was deposed and replaced by a dictator, the Shah. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, deposed. But these are by Western-backed coups, right? Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, Arbenz in Guatemala, Obote in Uganda, Lumumba in the Congo, Sukarno in Indonesia. Over and over again, we saw these progressive leaders toppled by Western powers. And this, again, is part of our story that has fallen out of our consciousness. And so all of this was like a way of chipping away at these gains that the global South was making in the world economy. But the real decisive blow came in 1980 when the US Federal Reserve jacked up interest rates on the US dollar to like 20%. Okay, this pushed a huge number of global South governments to the brink of defaults. And because Wall Street was so overexposed to these toxic debts, they used the World Bank and IMF, which are controlled by the US Treasury, to roll out structural adjustment programs across the global South. Okay. Now these are programs that are basically designed to forcibly liberalize markets. And so they privatize public assets, they cut social spending on healthcare and education, they cut tariffs and subsidies and protections, they cut protections on labor and the environment and so on. And so in effect, it was a kind of bloodless coup where you were able to dismantle these progressive economic reforms, in one fell swoop, more or less, and shift power over economic policy to technocrats in Washington and New York, who, in the World Bank and at Wall Street, right? And the consequences of this were devastating. And this is really where the story of poverty and inequality in the modern period comes into its own, because we saw income growth rates collapse during the 80s and 90s. 1.2 billion people were added to the ranks of the poor. We saw this, in those poverty graphs I showed you earlier. If you want to know the reason for persistent global poverty today, that's it. I mean, it was these policies that were forcibly imposed on global South countries with devastating effects. So this piece of the story has to be part of our analysis, I think, of why things are as unequal today as they are.
Mm-hmm. Which is so shocking. Like, what happened? What caused the global economy to become so fundamentally flawed?
Well, I guess primarily all of this it all boils down ultimately to power imbalances in the global economy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So take the World Bank and IMF, for example. These two institutions are two of the primary institutions that determine the rules of the global economy. And yet, if you look at voting power in these institutions, what you see is that it's deeply unequal. So the U.S. has veto power over every major decision in the World Bank and IMF. The G8 and a few other rich nations control more than half of the votes. Okay, the Global South, which has 85% or more of the population, controls less than half of the votes in the World Bank and IMF, which means that they have no control over the policies that end up affecting them. But there's also the World Trade Organization, which is technically, one country, one vote, but in reality, the richest countries have the most bargaining power when it comes to determining the rules of global trade. And what that means is countries that grew rich during the colonial period now get to determine how trade is organized, and they do it primarily in their interests. And over again, we have proof that trade rules in WTO are deeply biased against global South countries, particularly agricultural exporters, and in favor of global North countries. So basically what we have is a kind of global apartheid in the global economic governance system, where a small number of rich countries, primarily white, get to control these rules. And which is interesting, is if this was the case in any national context, we would obviously cry foul. It's obviously like a racial divide, but also deeply corrupt. But it operates at the level of global economic governance, and in the West, nobody bats an eyelid. I mean, we benefit tremendously from this arrangement, even though global South negotiators and leaders have been calling for democratization for decades. I mean, their simple demand is, please just democratize these institutions of global governance. So I think that paying attention to those power imbalances is really important to understanding, the deep reasons for why this remains the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So earlier I mentioned that your book helped me understand some of the systemic injustices that have surfaced. And I was wondering if you could tell us about some current events that surfaced these flaws and made them more apparent to the public.
I guess what's happened since the global financial crisis, I think, has really brought some of this to light, because people are wising up to the way that their own economies work in Western countries, right? Like after the global financial crisis, it became clear that the economy is effectively unfair. And so we had Occupy, and we had the Arab Spring, and we had protest movements erupting everywhere. And now we have protests around climate change, and it's increasingly apparent that global North countries are the ones that are primarily responsible for excess emissions, right? So, I mean, for instance, global North countries are responsible for a total of 92% of all global excess emissions. I mean, these are the major drivers of climate breakdown. As these crises of inequality and climate breakdown become clear, people are waking up to how this connects to history, and how the organization of our economies is basically quite biased in favor of a handful of rich people, and I think that's helped people understand how it works globally as well. So there's more attention on the issue now, which has been helpful, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really overwhelming to think about. It's overwhelming for me because to think about the people who are part of controlling the system. The power has been passed down over generations. And what do you think? How do you restructure the global economy when it's beneficial to the people who control it?
Yeah, I mean it's tricky. Again, like the main demand that global South nations have been making is is for democracy, which should resonate with people in Western countries because it's a value that we putatively hold. Right now, of course, it runs against the interests of those who benefit so prodigiously from the status quo. But I think it's something we have to take seriously and do our parts to pressure our own politicians to change our country's stance on some of these rules in the global economy. So, I say our countries. I'm a citizen of Swaziland, but I've spent a lot of time in the US and UK, and this is kind of my space these days, I suppose. But I recently helped one of the political parties here in this country rethink their international development paradigm, and we actually managed to get them to commit to things like pushing for democratization in global governance, and that's huge. I mean, right, this is the kind of thing we have to have our political parties commit to before we can see any kind of substantial change. Right, so I think that's
Yeah, so Jason, I read your book, The Divide, from the lens of a designer, which is what I do at Google. And, I used to think that the design, all these systems that feed into the global economy was broken. And then I think the epiphany I had from reading your book is that the design is actually working exactly the way it's supposed to, in a way that hurts so many people so that the global north can stay ahead. And this is something that was really upsetting to me. And that was why I was inspired to reach out to you. So kind of shifting gears to, what we can actually do with all the knowledge and information, can you tell us what you think we can do to popularize these ideas?
Yeah, that's a hard question because I myself am not necessarily good at this, but I think that the lesson for all of us here is that, look, I mean, these insights have actually been in the academic community for a very long time. I mean, there's nothing new. I mean, it's been part of Global South critique, in universities there. It's been in the academic literature more broadly. I mean, major economic historians have published books on these issues, but it doesn't make it into mass public communication because it's a more complex story that just doesn't fit with our usual expectations. So what do you do to popularize them? I'm not sure. We need better communication, right? Mm-hmm. We need more savvy ways to tell these stories, be it through documentaries or social media platforms, or whatever, op-eds, etc. Also by changing, I think, curricula. This is really important and something we've been fighting for here in the UK. We have to have a more honest story about the past 500 years, told in our schools. Otherwise, we get fed what is effectively propaganda, and that's not acceptable. But yeah, I mean, it's a struggle. I mean, communication is the terrain where everything is fought. We have freedom of ideas, and so we can publish academic books on these issues, but that doesn't mean they make it into the mainstream, right? So, right. I guess this is actually where I would seek advice from people in your space who have a lot of experience with public communication. Mm-hmm. I think these are the kind of alliances we have to create, I think.
Right. Yeah. It's really interesting that you mentioned stories because even if we have all this knowledge and information, it's all too abstract and a lot of people might not know what to do with it. So how can we make these ideas more relevant and relatable to people? And, it's so abstract that when we don't see or experience the inequality firsthand.
Yeah, it's a question that I've struggled with myself, actually. Certainly because if I'm trying to communicate to a British public, then one way to go about it is to say, look, your country has done so much harm to other people in the world, which is effective to an only limited extent. Another option is to say, look, we have to recognize that we are fighting similar battles, right? So people in the global south are fighting for fairness in a global economic system that is fundamentally unfair and geared towards a small elite. And we too in our own nations are fighting similar battles. And this is abundantly clear, in places like the US where inequality is exploding. So I guess the question, really is like, can we connect this to people's own experience of inequality and unfairness and recognize that, look, I mean, ultimately the global economy is so disproportionate that, the richest 5% of the human population captures almost half of global GDP every year. I mean, that's extraordinary. That means, right, half of all the labor that we render and all the resources that we dig up and all the emissions that we emit, et cetera, go to making the global 5% richer, which is crazy. It's a fundamentally insane system. We experience this on both sides of the North-South divide, and we have to be able to build bridges and fight that, together. I think that kind of solidarity is really important.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's this movement for pushing for large change. But at least for me, our contributions can sometimes feel inadequate and insignificant as an individual. So and I want to do more, make a difference, but I'm afraid that I myself can't make that difference. So what do you think we can do as individuals to have the most impact, especially for people like us who are in a position of privilege?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, I teach university students, and so many of them come into the classroom and they're eager to think about global problems, and they want to participate in international development and stuff like that. There's a huge industry that gets students involved in in sort of charity oriented interventions in the global South. Millions of kids do this for their gap years. There's a huge NGO industrial complex that is worth billions of dollars. What I like to say is, imagine if all of that was, all of that charity work was directed not towards charity and aid, but rather towards shifting our economy towards justice. What if we shifted from a charity paradigm to a justice paradigm, and channeled all of that energy and passion and love and money into actually targeting the root structural drivers of global inequality and poverty? I mean, we would see a change overnight, right? What if these students that I encounter were not building wells, but rather taking their demands to the doors of the IMF and the World Bank, right? Or what if they were arguing for a global minimum wage or something like that to sort of directly address labor exploitation? These would be interventions that would make a real difference. And it's not beyond the pale of possibility. I mean, the civil rights movement won this way by organizing. Right. The anti-colonial movement won this way, again, by organizing, by creating, connections and solidarities. I think the key for people in the global North is to realize these struggles are already being fought. So please, connect with existing movements for justice in the South, build alliances, and do what you can to pressure your own politicians, because that's the train on which this struggle has to be fought, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So kind of on that note, in your book, you propose and outline 5 solutions. And I was hoping you can list these out and explain them to us.
Yeah, sure. So one of my main things is that I lead with this, the importance of democratization. And right, so again, I've discussed this, so I won't go over it again. But this is the way to make sure that you rebalance power relations in the global economy, allow the global South to determine economic policy in a way that's more suited to their interests. This is absolutely essential. But another key step here is debt cancellation, right? And the reason this is important is because debt is used and has been used for decades as an instrument of remote control power by creditors. Creditors can effectively, like the World Bank and IMF, but also private creditors, can actually determine what kinds of economic policies debtors are able to implement, right? They effectively have that power, which constrains the kind of policy space that global South countries have. They can't do the things that we know work well, right? Using tariffs and subsidies. Tariffs, again, to protect their markets from being undercut by cheap imports from Western countries, cheap subsidized imports, and then also using subsidies to build their own infant industries so they can compete more effectively on the world stage, right? Now, we know that these tactics, these protectionist, progressive interventionist tactics, not only were used by rich nations for their own industrial development, but every example of success that we have in the South, these were used, okay? So China, the East Asian tigers, these policies were used by them. And yet they're denied to countries that are under the thumb of structural adjustment. And so canceling debts gives poor countries the freedom to use policies that we know work really effectively to address poverty and inequality. But another thing we have to do is tax justice, right? Global North countries control the global tax havens. $32 trillion is stored in these tax havens, a huge portion of our world's wealth. And so, that's something that we can directly tackle and close the loopholes that allow multinational companies to siphon profits out of global South countries and stash them in tax havens, which is what's presently being done on an industrial scale. Another thing I think is, again, what I mentioned earlier, global minimum wage, right? I mean, if we're going to have a system where capital is globalized, then it stands to reason that we globalize the rules to protect people from it. So we need to make sure that everyone who contributes labor to the global economy gets compensated fairly for that. And right now, people in the global South do not get compensated fairly. I mean, they're effectively treated as disposable. So a global minimum wage would not be like a uniform boundary. It would be, we proposed it would be tied to, say, 50% of a country's median income. And so it would fluctuate based on economic circumstances and would not cause any disruption to the way that comparative advantage works in the global economy. But would be a huge, almost instantaneously would help end poverty in a stroke. So it's a really key intervention.
Mm-hmm. So, I imagine that you've probably encountered some resistance to some of these solutions that you're proposing. I'm sure not everyone's on board. And so I was wondering how you respond to common counter arguments for these ideas.
Yeah, well, one of the counter arguments for a global minimum wage is, how would you do it? Like, who would manage this? And that's interesting because I reached out to the International Labor Organization a couple of years ago when I was doing research on this issue. And they pointed out that they actually have the capacity to do it. I mean, it's not a capacity problem. They've actually been saying, we're willing to do this. We have the capacity. It's relatively simple to do. It's just a matter of political will. So, and it's just not on our agenda. Like, if you Google global minimum wage, you'll find there's like a few economists who've written about this. It's not part of the public debate at all. It needs to be, absolutely. So that's one. I mean, some people will say, like, about the debt question, but debts are owed, and my answer to that is maybe, but also they've all been paid off many times over. And this is true, right? Like, because of the miracle of compound interest, many global South nations have been paying debts off many times over. And some of these debts are still owed from decades ago. Some of them were taken, were taken out by dictators long since deposed. Some of those dictators were stooges of Western powers, installed by Western powers. So, we consider these to be odious debts, and they're not legitimate. And debts like these that have been paid off, and also debts that are odious or illegitimate, I think can be canceled without any moral qualms, without hurting anybody. In fact, there's this amazing line from Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, who at one point pointed out, he, in a famous speech he gave at the African Union, said, "Look, debt is effectively a form of neocolonialism, and the thing about debt is that, we don't have to pay it. If we don't pay, nobody dies. Whereas if we do pay, then our people die." And this realization that if democracy is going to mean anything, it should be the ability to decide to arrange things differently. And given that debt is just a fabrication in the first place, we can decide to arrange that differently. I think that's very liberating.
Got it. Another challenge I suspect you might face by proposing the solutions you outlined is lack of support for a variety of reasons from certain groups and individuals. For the people who don't support or want to contribute to your proposed solution, whether it's because they don't align with their personal or political beliefs, are there ways you can restructure the argument so that you can explain how it can benefit them as well?
Yeah, I guess one thing is to say that, first of all, everybody wants to see the end of poverty, right? And yet, the end of poverty is perpetually deferred. In fact, at existing rates of trickle down in the global economy, it will take around 200 years to end poverty. This is according to UN economists themselves. That's wild. Like, who wants to tolerate such a system? So if your commitment is to see at minimum the end of poverty, then we have to start thinking about the structural drivers of this, and not just assume that the status quo is somehow going to magically take care of it. One of the things that always blows my mind is this fact, right? Like, to close the poverty gap at $7.40 a day, to lift everybody above that line would take about $6 trillion US, which sounds like a lot of money, but keep in mind that the richest 1% have an income every year of $19 trillion. So $6 trillion is like a fraction of what the richest 1% earn. These are all millionaires and billionaires, right? So, the labor and resources that are rendered in the global economy come primarily from the South, and yet they receive a tiny fraction of what is actually of the income the global economy generates. The vast majority goes to the very rich, right? So I think anybody can get on board with the fact that that is wildly unfair. But the other thing is to understand that, like, look, our system is unstable and dangerous, and we can see the instability playing out before us right now. If we want to be able to end poverty and at the same time achieve ecological stability and our climate goals and so on, the only way to do that is with a fair distribution of existing income. So, in a way, there's a strong scientific case for this. But also because, like, ultimately, on some deep level, I think that we're all affected by this, right? Like, who wants to live in an economy where you know that your lifestyle, your privilege depends on the exploitation of people and resources in other parts of the world? Ultimately, I think that we're on some level depressed by that fact. And what's the point of living that way? Like, we can do much better.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, with any movement, sometimes it's difficult to get the volume of support that is sustainable over a long period of time. Hopefully having you here sharing this knowledge right now will inspire some viewers to take action. But what can we do to keep the momentum going?
Gosh, I think it's really just about keeping the conversation going. And I've been inspired by seeing, recent developments. I think a lot of NGOs are picking up on some of this critique, and people in the NGO sector I meet all the time giving talks, are eager for a different approach. I mean, they realize that our existing approach is fundamentally flawed and not working. It doesn't sit well with them. They can tell it's a lie on some level, right? So, people want something different, something more intelligent, something sharper, and so what's exciting for me is to see that these ideas are gaining traction, are finding audiences, but it really all depends on the extent to which we keep that conversation going, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and last question before we move on to Q&A. Just as your book was seminal to me, are there any books that had a strong influence in your research? And what resources do you recommend for further research?
Yeah, okay. A few people come to mind, and I'm so glad to be able to say their names because they're very special to me. One would be Amy Césaire, who was a really key anti-colonial thinker from Martinique. He wrote a little book called Discourse on Colonialism, which to me is honestly one of the most powerful pieces of text that exists in the world. It's almost like spoken word, in fact. Every time I read it, I feel it's powerful and relevant and gives me almost shivers down my spine. So an amazing book. He's been a big inspiration to me. Also, more contemporarily speaking, an economist at Cambridge, his name is Ha-Joon Chang. He's a kind of mentor to me, and all of his books were a big influence on me. He has a book called Kicking Away the Ladder, which basically outlines the way that the very strategies that the global North used in their own industrial development, they then turned around and denied to the global South through structural adjustment programs. So it's a powerful read. He also has a book called Bad Samaritans, which is kind of a story of globalization and also a story of the World Bank and IMF and World Trade Organization and the kind of harm they've done in the world. There's also an economic historian by the name of Sven Beckert, who wrote a book called Empire of Cotton, which tells the story of how colonization and the slave trade were really essential. Basically, it's impossible to imagine Europe's industrialization without taking account of the violence of these two processes. And also an amazing Indian economic historian by the name of Utsa Patnaik, whose empirical work on the drain of resources and labor from the global South to the global North has been very inspiring to me. I mean, she's one of the most powerful minds in economics, I think, and is sort of an unstoppable force. There's also a small book by David Harvey called A Brief History of Neoliberalism. He's a geographer. And it's probably the most concise history of economics over the past 40 years that I've encountered, which is very useful.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for sharing all those resources. That's a lot. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to move on to audience questions, and there are quite a few of them. So I think maybe I'll share what Jimmy asked, which I think is really relevant for us as Googlers. Jimmy says, please, can you share thoughts on how tech companies are growing or leveling global inequality? Any examples of initiatives or companies that have been successful in solving this problem?
It's a good question. It's not something that I am super focused on, but I will say this. One of the major ways that the tech world makes money is through intellectual property, right? And so, and this is a bit of a sticky issue. Basically, it makes money by charging patent fees and rents effectively on intellectual property, and because of that, it lobbies really hard on the global stage, even at the WTO, to extend patent laws and patent protections way beyond what we ever had historically, right? So Bill Gates, for instance, and Microsoft have been really instrumental in trying to push expanded patent laws around the world, and the consequences of this can be really destructive. Like, I grew up in Swaziland during the height of the AIDS crisis. My parents are doctors. They were watching their patients die one after the other, and they knew for a fact it was possible to get cheap generic antiretroviral drugs that would save their lives, right? But they were not allowed to import them because of the TRIPS agreement, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights agreements in the WTO, which prevented them from importing generic drugs. They had to buy them from U.S. companies at extraordinarily high rates of markup, tens of thousands of dollars, which is not affordable for a person living in Swaziland. So they literally watch people die as a consequence of intellectual property laws. So even when they're brought in to protect tech, they end up having these other consequences, on medicines and so on. But also we know that and also things like solar panels, right? Like, poor countries need access to solar panels. Sometimes they're unaffordable because of intellectual property laws. So the more that we can do to make intellectual property laws fairer, so that we can share knowledge more quickly and more easily, I think the better. And I think the tech industry has to play a major role in thinking through that problem.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Here's a question from Randall. His latest question. This is something that you mentioned in your book, but I don't think you had a chance to kind of expand on it. So Randall's question is, how big a factor is corruption in the global South to affecting reform there and elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a good question. We have pretty clear data on this. So corruption is a big problem in a lot of countries. The World Bank estimates that that corruption costs global South countries about $60 billion a year, $30 to $60 billion a year, which is a lot of money. But on the other hand, it's small fry compared to illicit financial outflows, right? So Global Financial Integrity, which looks at this issue, basically says, look, corruption accounts for maybe 3% of total illicit outflows of money from global South countries. The vast majority come from multinational companies, mostly headquartered in Western nations, that steal their profits out of global South countries to avoid paying taxes, right? Through the mechanism I mentioned before. That's in the region of $1 trillion a year. So way more than the kind of corruption that we see from local elites or local political leaders and so on. So I guess the key point here for me is yes, let's pay attention to corruption, but let's also recognize that the real drivers of the bigger problem of corruption actually has to do with a part of the discourse we don't talk about, right? Tax havens or secrecy jurisdictions, these are illicit financial outflows. These are, it's against the law, right? And yet the countries that support tax havens, like the UK, Switzerland, the US, Manhattan and Denmark are major tax havens. Not Denmark, sorry. Delaware are major tax havens, and yet we consider these countries to be not corrupt. When in fact, the argument that I'm trying to make here is that sometimes it's global North countries that are actually more corrupt and are driving this problem much more so than petty corruption in the global South. And I think that has to be part of our story. So that's what I want to try to bring back into the picture.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question from Harshad, and this one really resonates with me because you talk about climate change and climate policies a lot in your book, and we didn't really get a chance to expand on it too much. So Harshad's question is, Western economies could grow without worrying about harms in the environment. Today, how can developing economies balance growth and environmental concerns?
Yeah, well, I guess the key thing to realize here is that okay, we're in the middle of an ecological crisis. That's abundantly clear. And it's not just climate change; it's also, overshoot on all sorts of other planetary boundaries, species extinction rates, resource overuse, ocean acidification, etc. But it's crucial to recognize that global North nations are the primary drivers of these problems, right? So I mentioned before that global North nations are almost disproportionately responsible for excess emissions over the planetary boundary of 350 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. But they're also the ones that are driving resource overuse. So a sustainable level of resource consumption is around 7 tons per person per year, right? In the global North, in the USA, it's about 35 tons per person. So that's 5 times over the sustainable boundary. In low-income countries, to give you a sense, it's about 2 or 3 tons per person, so way under the boundary, right? So the question of dealing with our ecological crisis is primarily a question of global South countries need to be able to use more resources and energy for their own needs, to meet human needs, right? In the global North, the use of resources and energy is vastly unhinged from any conception of human need and has to be reduced substantially, right? Right? So, when it comes to addressing these crises, the global North has to lead, and that's a real challenge. Like, how do you organize an economy where you're trying to dramatically reduce energy and resource use? That has to be a key part of our conversation.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we have a question from Arabi, and I think this one's interesting because we're Google. So Arabi's question is, I've heard it said we are living in a post-nation state world in which power has largely shifted to transnational corporations. Do you agree? If so, what are the implications for global equality?
Yeah, I do agree in some crucial respects. Multinational companies are extremely powerful and are more powerful than most global South countries, for example, right? So yes, that's true. And I mean, look, if you look at like free trade agreements, bargaining in the World Trade Organization, et cetera, multinational companies are heavily involved in that. These are not transparent democratic processes where public negotiators face off. No, there's heavy lobbying behind this, and the firms that can produce the most lobbyists and pay the most money are the ones that get their way. I mean, this is, again, speaking of corruption, I mean, this is a deeply corrupt process. So so that has to be addressed, right? But at the same time, I think we also have to realize that discourse can go too far. States do have a lot of power, but the states that have power are rich states, right? So rich Western nations are the ones with power, and we have to recognize that those, that kind of state power continues to operate in what is effectively a kind of colonial manner in the modern contemporary economy, just like it did over the past few hundred years. So we shouldn't depart too much from our analysis of state power at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Thank you. Here's a question from Claudio. Since you mentioned global minimum wage, Claudio asks, could it be that it's more expensive to deal with inequality than supporting global minimum wage?
It's more expensive to deal with inequality than supporting. I mean, I guess I see a global minimum wage as an intervention in reducing inequality, and a very powerful one, actually. So, and in terms of cost, I don't really see that as a cost so much. I mean, yes, it would reduce corporate profits. Yes, it's going to reduce surplus appropriation in rich countries. Yes, it will make our goods a little bit more expensive, although not much. I mean, a few percentage points maybe. But I see all of that. I see all of that as not a cost, but rather a justice, a kind of fairness, right? Like, just as we demand a minimum wage for ourselves, and we consider anything any company that does not pay a minimum wage to Western workers, we think that that's an outrageous moral violation. And yet, the very companies that we headquarter in Western nations routinely pay less than poverty wages to workers in the global south. I mean that is apartheid, right? There's no other way of thinking about it. We tend to think about the global north and global south as fundamentally disparate places, but they're not. I mean, this is one global economy. The vast majority of the stuff that we consume comes from the global south. The vast majority of the labor that our economy relies on comes from the global south. It's one economy, and we have to start thinking about unitary standards, not some standards for white people and other standards for the South.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jason. So we're at time, so I'm just gonna close us off. Actually, do you have any closing statements that you like to make?
Oh no, I guess not. I think I've covered most of the points I was hoping to talk about. Thank you for your really interesting questions, and thank you all for participating. I'm sorry I can't see your faces. Ideally, we would be in person, but maybe one of these days. And please feel free to email me with any additional questions you have, or engage with me on Twitter. I'm happy to carry the conversation on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Jason, for all the valuable work you're doing. And this is exactly what the world needs right now. So thanks for chatting with us and sharing with us your knowledge and time.
Thanks very much, Lisa.